Chapter 3. You shall not kill. God's holy law. If you would enter life, keep the commandments. Gospel and commandment. 52. God's commandment is never detached from his love. It is always a gift meant for man's growth and joy. As such, it represents an essential and indispensable aspect of the gospel. The gospel of life is both a great gift from God and an exacting task for humanity. In giving life to man, God demands that he love, respect, and promote life. The gift thus becomes a commandment, and the commandment is itself a gift. Man, as the living image of God, is willed by his Creator to be ruler and Lord. Created to exercise dominion over the world, he was given a likeness to the King of the universe. However, man's lordship is not absolute, but ministerial. It is a reflection of the unique and infinite lordship of God. Therefore, man must exercise it with the wisdom and love through obedience to God's holy law. From man in regard to his fellow man, I will demand an accounting for human life. Human life is sacred and inviolable. 53. God alone is the Lord of life. No one, in any circumstance, has the right to destroy directly an innocent human being. God proclaims that he is absolute Lord of the life of man, who is formed in his image and likeness. Human life is thus given a sacred and inviolable character, which reflects the inviolability of the Creator himself. God will severely judge every violation of the commandment, "You shall not kill," the commandment which is at the basis of all life together in society. 54. The precept, "You shall not kill," is strongly negative, indicating the extreme limit which can never be exceeded. However, it implicitly encourages a positive attitude of absolute respect for life. It leads to the promotion of life and to progress along the way of a love which gives, receives, and serves. The people of the covenant progressively matured in this way of thinking, and thus prepared for the proclamation of Jesus, that the commandment to love one's neighbor is like the commandment to love God. From the beginning, the living tradition of the Church upheld God's command not to kill. The Didache, the oldest non-biblical Christian writing, explicitly condemns both abortion and infanticide, and indicates that they belong to the way of death. 55. While killing a human being is obviously a serious sin, Christian reflection has always sought a fuller and deeper understanding of what God's commandment prohibits and prescribes. In certain situations, values proposed by God's law seem to involve a paradox. For example, in the case of legitimate self-defense, the right to protect one's own life may be difficult to reconcile with the duty not to harm someone else's life. The intrinsic value of life and the duty to love oneself no less than one's neighbor are the basis of a true right to self-defense. Moreover, legitimate defense can not only be a right, but a grave duty for someone responsible for another's life, the common good of the family or of the state. Unfortunately, it happens that the need to render the aggressor incapable of causing harm sometimes involves taking his life. 56. This is the context in which to place the problem of the death penalty. On this matter, there is a growing tendency, both in the Church and in civil society, to demand that it be applied in a very limited way, or even that it be abolished completely. The problem must be viewed in the context of a system of penal justice that is ever more in line with human dignity and thus with God's plan for man and society. The primary purpose of punishment inflicted by a society is to remedy the disorder caused by the offense. Adequate punishment is assigned as a condition for the offender to regain the exercise of his or her freedom. In this way, public authority fulfills the purpose of defending the public order and ensuring people's safety. while at the same time offering the offender an incentive to change his or her behavior and be rehabilitated. The nature and extent of the punishment must be carefully evaluated and ought not to go to the extreme of executing an offender unless absolutely necessary, namely when it would not be possible otherwise to defend society. Today, such cases are very rare, if not practically non-existent. 57. If such great care must be taken to respect the lives of criminals and unjust aggressors, the command "do not kill" has absolute value when it refers to the innocent person, and all the more so for those who are weak and defenseless. The absolute inviolability of innocent human life is a moral truth clearly taught by sacred scripture, constantly upheld in the Church's tradition, and constantly proposed by her magisterium. Therefore, by the authority which Christ conferred upon Peter and his successors, and in communion with the bishops of the Catholic Church, I confirm that the direct and voluntary killing of an innocent human being is always gravely immoral. This doctrine, based upon that unwritten law, which man in the light of reason finds in his own heart, is reaffirmed by sacred scripture, transmitted by the tradition of the Church, and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. The deliberate decision to deprive an innocent human being of life is always evil and can never be licit, either as an end in itself or as a means to a good end. It contradicts the virtues of justice and charity. Nothing and no one can in any way permit the killing of an innocent human being, whether a fetus or an embryo, an infant or an adult, an old person or one suffering from an incurable disease, or a person who is dying. Furthermore, no one is permitted to ask for this act killing either for himself or herself, or for another person entrusted to his or her care, nor can he or she consent to it, either explicitly or implicitly, nor can any authority legitimately recommend or permit such an action. As far as the right to life is concerned, every innocent human being is absolutely equal to all others. Your eyes beheld my unformed substance, the unspeakable crime of abortion. 58. Among all crimes against life, abortion has characteristics making it particularly serious and deplorable. But today, in many people's consciences, the perception of its gravity has become progressively obscured. The acceptance of abortion in the popular mind, in behavior, and even in law itself is a sign of an extremely dangerous crisis of the moral sense, which is becoming more and more incapable of distinguishing between good and evil. You need now, more than ever, the courage to look truth in the eye and call things by their proper name. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. Ambiguous terminology is used to hide abortion's true nature, but no word has the power to change the reality. Abortion is the deliberate and direct killing of a human being in the initial phase of his or her existence. And no one is more innocent than an unborn child. While the decision to have an abortion is often tragic and painful for the mother, insofar as the decision to pursue an abortion is not made for purely selfish reasons or out of convenience, but out of a desire to protect certain important values, such as her own health or a decent standard of living for the other members of the family, such reasons can never justify the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. 59. In addition to the mother herself, there are often others who decide upon the death of a child in the womb. The father of the child may be to blame, either by directly pressuring the woman to have an abortion, or by indirectly encouraging such a decision by leaving her to face the problems of pregnancy alone. Such actions mortally wound the family in its vocation to be a sanctuary of life and its nature as a community of love. Responsibility may also lie with the wider family circle and friends who place pressure on a pregnant woman, doctors, nurses, and healthcare administrators who place their skills at the service of death, legislators who promote and approve abortion, those who have encouraged sexual permissiveness and a lack of esteem for motherhood. Those who should have ensured, but did not, effective family and social policies in support of families and international institutions which campaign for legalized abortion around the world. In this sense, abortion goes beyond the responsibility of individuals and beyond the harm done to them and takes on a distinctly social dimension. We are facing what can be called a structure of sin, which opposes human life not yet born. 60. Some try to justify abortion by claiming that the result of conception cannot yet be considered human life, at least up to a certain stage of development. But from the time of fertilization, a life is begun, which is neither that of the father or the mother. It is rather the life of a new human being with his own growth. It would never be made human if it were not human already. Modern genetic science offers clear confirmation. It has demonstrated that from the first instant there is established the program of what this living being will be, a person. This individual person with his characteristic aspects already well determined. What is at stake is so important that the mere probability that a human person is involved would suffice to justify an absolutely clear prohibition of any intervention aimed at killing a human embryo. The Church has always taught and continues to teach that the result of the human procreation from its first moment of existence must be guaranteed unconditional respect. The human being is to be respected and treated as a person from the moment of conception, and first among his rights as a person is the right to life. 61. The texts of sacred scripture never address the question of deliberate abortion, and so do not directly and specifically condemn it. But they show such great respect for the human being in the mother's womb that they require as a logical consequence that God's commandment, "You shall not kill," be extended to the unborn child as well. All human beings, from their mother's womb, belong to God, who searches and knows them, who forms them and knits them together with his own hands, who gazes on them when they are tiny, shapeless embryos, and already sees in them the adults of tomorrow, whose vocation is even now written in the book of life. From its first contact with the Greco-Roman world, in which abortion and infanticide were widely practiced, the first Christian community radically opposed such customs. Throughout Christianity's 2,000-year history, the same doctrine has been constantly taught by the fathers of the Church and her pastors and doctors. 62. The more recent papal magisterium has vigorously reaffirmed this common doctrine. The Second Vatican Council upheld that, from the moment of its conception, life must be guarded with the greatest care, while abortion and infanticide are unspeakable crimes. The Church's canonical discipline from the earliest centuries has inflicted penal sanctions on those guilty of abortion. Given such unanimity in the doctrinal and disciplinary tradition of the Church, Paul VI was able to declare that this tradition is unchanged and unchangeable. Therefore, by the authority which Christ conferred upon Peter and his successors in communion with the bishops, who on various occasions have condemned abortion and who in the aforementioned consultation, albeit dispersed throughout the world, have shown unanimous agreement concerning this document, I declare that direct abortion, that is, abortion willed as an ends or as a means, always constitutes a grave moral disorder, since it is the deliberate killing of an innocent human being. This doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. No circumstance, no purpose, no law whatsoever can ever make licit an act which is intrinsically illicit, since it is contrary to the law of God, which is written in every human heart, knowable by reason itself, and proclaimed by the Church. 63. The evaluation of the morality of abortion is to be applied also to the recent forms of intervention on human embryos, which, although carried out for the purposes legitimate in themselves, inevitably involved the killing of those embryos. The use of human embryos or fetuses as an object for experimentation, inevitably leading to their death, is a crime against their dignity as human beings who have a right to the same respect owed to a child once born. Likewise, procedures that exploit human embryos and fetuses to be used as providers of organs or tissues must also be condemned. The killing of innocent human beings, even if carried out to help others, is an absolutely unacceptable act. Prenatal diagnostic testing that enables early detection of anomalies in an unborn child can also be problematic. While such testing can be ethical when used to provide therapeutic care or help families prepare for a child's arrival, they are often used with eugenic intention to prevent the birth of a child affected by various types of anomalies. Such an attitude is reprehensible, since it presumes to measure the value of human life only within the parameters of normality and physical well-being, thus opening the way to legitimizing infanticide and euthanasia as well. It is I who bring both death and life, the tragedy of euthanasia. 64. At the end of life's spectrum, men and women find themselves facing the mystery of death as a result of advances in medicine and in a culture context often closed to the transcendent of the experience of dying is marked by new features. When the prevailing tendency is to value life only to the extent that it brings pleasure and well-being, suffering seems like an unbearable setback, something from which one must be freed at all costs. When he denies his fundamental relationship to God, man thinks he is his own rule and measure, with the right to demand that society should guarantee him the ways and means of deciding what to do with his life in full and complete autonomy. The temptation towards euthanasia grows, that is, to take control of death and bring it about before its time, gently, and in one's own life or that of another. While such an action may appear logical and humane, in reality, it is senseless and inhumane. In societies preoccupied with efficiency, elderly and disabled people are seen as intolerable and too burdensome. 65. Euthanasia, in the strict sense, is an action or omission which of itself and by intention causes death, with the purpose of eliminating all suffering. It must be distinguished from decisions to forego aggressive medical treatments that no longer correspond to the real situation of the patient, either because they are by now disproportionate to any expected results or because they impose an excessive burden on the patient and his family. In such situations, when death is clearly imminent and inevitable, one can in conscience refuse forms of treatment that would only secure a precarious and burdensome prolongation of life, so long as the normal care due to the sick person in similar cases is not interrupted. To forego extraordinary and disproportionate means is not the equivalent of suicide or euthanasia. It rather expresses acceptance of the human condition in the face of death. In modern medicine, increased attention is being given to methods of palliative care which seek to make suffering more bearable in the final stages of illness. Painkillers and sedatives can be used to relieve the patient's pain, even when the result is decreased consciousness and a shortening of life. If no other means exist, and if in the given circumstances this does not prevent the carrying out of other religious and moral duties, in such cases death is not willed or sought. There is simply a desire to ease pain effectively. A dying person should not be deprived of consciousness without a serious reason. He or she ought to be allowed to prepare for their definitive meeting with God. Taken into account these distinctions in harmony with the magisterium of my predecessors and in communion with the bishops of the Catholic Church, I confirm that euthanasia is a grave violation of the law of God, since it is the deliberate and morally unacceptable killing of a human person. This doctrine is based upon the natural law and upon the written word of God, is transmitted by the Church's tradition, and taught by the ordinary and universal magisterium. 66. Suicide is always as morally objectionable as murder. It involves the rejection of love of self and the renunciation of justice and charity towards one's neighbor, towards the communities to which one belongs, and towards society as a whole. In its deepest reality, suicide represents a rejection of God's absolute sovereignty over life and death. To support the intention of another to commit suicide or to help in carrying it out through so-called assisted suicide means to cooperate in or to be the actual perpetrator of an injustice that can never be excused, even if it is requested, even when not motivated by a selfish refusal to be burdened with the life of someone who is suffering. Euthanasia is a false mercy. True compassion leads to sharing another's pain. It does not kill the person whose suffering we cannot bear. Euthanasia becomes more serious when it takes the form of murder of a person who has in no way requested or consented to it. The height of injustice is reached when certain people, such as physicians or legislators, assume the power to decide who ought to live and who ought to die. Once again, we find ourselves before the temptation of Eden to become like God, who knows good and evil. 67. The way of love and true mercy are quite different from this. The request arising from the human heart confronting suffering and death is above all a request for companionship, sympathy, and support in the time of trial. It is a plea for help to keep on hoping when all human hopes fail. Our natural aversion to death is illuminated by Christian faith, which promises a share in the victory of the risen Christ. The certainty of future immortality and hope in the promised resurrection cast new light on the mystery of suffering and death, and fill the believer with an extraordinary capacity to trust fully in the plan of God. In the words of the Apostle Paul, none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. If we live in the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. Dying to the Lord means experiencing one's death as the supreme act of obedience to the Father. Living to the Lord means recognizing that suffering can always become a source of good if experienced for love and with love through sharing in the suffering of Christ crucified. We must obey God rather than man. Civil law and the moral law. 68. One of the specific characteristics of present-day attacks on human life consists in the legal justification for them, as if they were rights which the state must acknowledge as belonging to citizens. It is often claimed that the life of an unborn child or a seriously disabled person is only a relative good, a good that should be compared and balanced against other goods. It is even maintained that only someone present and personally involved in such a situation can correctly judge the goods at stake. Consequently, only that person would be able to decide on the morality of his choice. Therefore, this faulty logic continues the state should respect this choice, even to the point of permitting abortion and euthanasia. At other times, it is claimed that civil law cannot demand that all citizens should live according to moral standards higher than what all citizens themselves acknowledge and share. More radical views go so far as to maintain that in a modern and pluralistic society, people should be allowed complete freedom to dispose of their own lives, as well as the lives of the unborn. 69. In the democratic culture of our time, it is commonly held that the legal system of any society should limit itself to accepting the convictions of the majority. If it is believed that an objective truth shared by all is unobtainable, then respect for the freedom of the citizens would require that on a legislative level, the autonomy of individual consciences be acknowledged. As a result, we have two diametrically opposed tendencies. On the one hand, individuals claim for themselves complete freedom in the moral sphere and demand that the state should not impose any ethical position, but limit itself to guaranteeing maximum space for the freedom of each individual. On the other hand, it is held that, in exercising public and professional duties, respect for other people's freedom of choice requires that one set aside his or her own personal convictions to satisfy every demand of the citizens that is recognized by the law. It is held, therefore, that in carrying out one's duties, the only moral criterion should be what is laid down by the law itself. Individual responsibility is turned over to the civil law and personal conscience is renounced. 70. At the basis of all these tendencies lies the ethical relativism, which characterizes much of the present-day culture. Some consider such relativism essential to the democracy, whereas moral norms, considered to be objective and binding, are held to lead to authoritarianism and intolerance. The issue of respect for life, however, reveals the misunderstandings and contradictions concealed in this position. While history has seen crimes committed in the name of truth, equally grave crimes have and continue to be committed in the name of ethical relativism. When a parliamentary or social majority decrees that it is legal to kill unborn human life, is it not really making a tyrannical decision with regard to the most defenseless human beings? Democracy cannot be idolized to the point of making it a substitute for morality. Democracy is a system, and as such is a means and not an end. Its moral value is not automatic, but rather depends on conformity to the moral law. The value of democracy stands or falls with the values which it embodies and promotes. The basis of these values cannot be changeable majority opinions, but only the acknowledgement of an objective moral law. Otherwise, the democratic system itself would be reduced to a mere mechanism for regulating different and opposing interests on a purely empirical basis. 71. It is therefore urgently necessary to rediscover those essential and innate moral values which flow from the very truth of the human being and express and safeguard the dignity of the person, values which no individual, no majority, and no state can ever create, modify, or destroy, but must only acknowledge, respect, and promote. The purpose of civil law is different and more limited in scope than that of the moral law. In no sphere of life can the civil law take the place of conscience or dictate norms concerning things which are outside its competence, which is that of ensuring the common good of people through the recognition and defense of their fundamental rights and the promotion of peace and of public morality. The real purpose of civil law is to guarantee an ordered social coexistence in true justice. For this reason, civil law must ensure that all members of society enjoy respect for certain fundamental rights. First among these is the inviolable right to life of every innocent human being. The legal toleration of abortion and euthanasia can in no way claim to be based on the respect for the conscience of others. 72. The doctrine on the necessary conformity of civil law with the moral law is in continuity with the whole tradition of the Church. This is clear in the teaching of St. Thomas Aquinas, who writes that human law is law, inasmuch as it is in conformity with right reason, and thus derives from the eternal law. However, if a human law is somehow opposed to the natural law, then it is not really a law, but rather corruption of the law. Consequently, laws which legitimize the direct killing of innocent human beings through abortion or euthanasia are in complete opposition to the inviolability right to life. They thus deny the equality of everyone before the law. Such laws are radically opposed not only to the good of the individual, but also to the common good. They are completely lacking in authentic juridical validity. A civil law authorizing abortion or euthanasia ceases by that very fact to be true, morally binding civil law. 73. Abortion and euthanasia are crimes which no human law can claim to legitimize. There is no obligation in conscience to obey such laws. Rather, there is a grave and clear obligation to oppose them by conscientious objection. While Christians have a duty to obey legitimate public authorities, we must obey God rather than man. In the case of an intrinsically unjust law, such as a law permitting abortion or euthanasia, it is never licit to obey it, or to take part in the propaganda campaign in favor of such a law, or vote for it. When it is not possible to completely overturn an unjust law, an elected official whose absolute personal opposition to abortion was well known could licitly support proposals aimed at limiting the harm done by such a law and lessening its negative consequences at the level of general opinion and public morality. Such action does not represent illicit cooperation with an unjust law, but a legitimate attempt to limit its evil aspects. 74. Passage of unjust laws often creates difficult problems of conscience for morally upright people with regard to the issue of cooperation. Sometimes difficult choices must be made that requires a sacrifice of prestigious professional positions or reasonable hopes for career advancement. In other cases, it can happen that carrying out certain actions which are provided for by legislation that overall is unjust, but which in themselves are indifferent or even positive and serve to protect human lives under threat. Christians have a grave moral obligation not to cooperate formally in practices that, even if permitted by civil law, are contrary to God's law. It is never licit to cooperate formally in evil. Such cooperation occurs when an action, either by its very nature or by the form it takes in a concrete situation, can be defined as a direct participation in an act against innocent human life, or a sharing in the immoral intention of the person committing it. To refuse to take part in committing an injustice is not only a moral duty, it is a basic human right. The ability to refuse to take part in the phases of consultation, preparation, and execution of acts against life should be guaranteed to physician, health care personnel, and directors of hospitals and clinics. Those who consciously object should be protected not only from legal penalties, but also from any negative effects on the legal, disciplinary, financial, and professional plane. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Promote life. 75. God's commandments teach us the way of life. The negative moral precepts are valid always and everywhere, without exception. They make it clear that this choice of certain ways of acting is radically incompatible with the choice of God and the dignity of the human person created in his image. Such choices cannot be redeemed by the goodness of any intention or consequence. They contradict the fundamental decision to direct one's life to God. the negative moral precepts have an important positive function. The know which they unconditionally require makes clear and the absolute limit beneath which the free person cannot lower himself. At the same time, they indicate the minimum which he must respect. They provide the beginning and the first necessary stage of the journey towards freedom. 76. The commandment, "You shall not kill," establishes the point of departure for the start of true freedom. It leads us to promote life actively and to develop ways of thinking and acting which serve life. The Creator has entrusted the life of man to his own care, not to make arbitrary use of it, but to preserve it with wisdom and to care for it with loving fidelity. The God of the covenant has entrusted every individual to his or her fellow human beings as brothers and sisters according to the law of reciprocity in giving and receiving, of self-giving and of acceptance of others. The Spirit becomes the new law, which gives strength to believers and awakens in them a responsibility for sharing the gift of self and for accepting others as a sharing in the boundless love of Jesus Christ himself. 77. This new law gives spirit and shape to the commandment, "You shall not kill." For the Christian, it involves an absolute imperative to respect, love, and promote the life of every person in accordance to the requirements of God's bountiful love in Jesus Christ. He laid down his life for us. We ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. The commandment, "You shall not kill," even in its more positive aspects of respecting, loving, and promoting human life, is binding on every individual human being. It resounds in the moral conscience of all people as an irreplaceable echo of the original covenant of God the Creator with mankind. It is therefore a service of love that we are all called to provide to our neighbor in order that his or her life may always be defended and promoted, especially when it is weak or threatened. We are asked to love and honor the life of every man and woman and to work with perseverance and courage so that our time, marked by all too many signs of death, may at last witness the establishment of a new culture of life, the fruit of the culture of truth and love.